Hey, I'm Alan Furstenberg,
And I'm Mark Tucker. Welcome to Two Voice Devs.
Two Voice Devs. Howdy, Mark.
Hello, Ellen. How are you?
Hey, it's been a week. Another crazy week.
Yep, we're recording a little bit later on instead of the middle of the week, the end, and you can feel a few extra days in a week. They call them Fridays for a reason.
But you know, the reason why we held off a couple of days was because the week that we're recording this, the build up all week had been everyone was waiting for GPT-5, building excitement. Everyone was so excited to see what was coming, and it's out. So let's
Yep.
kind of take a first look, very, very first rough look at GPT-5 and what we're getting from it.
Yeah, so I think we'll touch on both, ChatGPT with the GPT-5 model, as well as what are available for developers, and specifically the GPT-5 model, the mini model, and the nano model.
And we kind of have to look at both of them because OpenAI has made it really difficult to figure out exactly what they're talking about when they talk about GPT-5 at any given point in time.
Yeah, it seems to be kind of a show for consumers of the ChatGPT product and why you would want to continue to use that. And also a hey, developers, you should be using the new models for everything that you do.
And that's kind of interesting because there's, I mean, just glancing at it, on the surface, it seems like it does everything that the previous ones did. But when you start digging into it, there are there are oddities going on around this that don't. It's not entirely clear exactly what's going on under the hood.
Yeah, they talked about using a model, but then there's smart routing built in. It's going to use the thinking model, spend some more time and some more tokens, to do certain things. Or if it doesn't need that, then it could give a quick response back.
Right. But it's also not clear exactly what will trigger the thinking version of the model. I used to describe Gemini as three models in a trench coat. And I think that's what we've
Yep.
got certainly with GPT-5. I mean, one we've seen is they're saying GPT-4 is now obsolete, the O series is now obsolete, and both of them kind of combined together into GPT-5. But there's still a lot that isn't clear. At least it isn't clear to me yet about what the implications of that are.
Yeah, there's. I think what they're trying to do, I felt a little bit overwhelmed with all the different models, or when would I use this model, or when would, and I think to a certain degree they're trying to make it simpler for developers to say just use the GPT-5 model for everything. And there's a parameter that will be able to ratchet down the reasoning level. So if you don't need that and you just need some simple, straightforward tasks, then you can use it for that. So that's something that
Right.
I think we
Well,
talked about before with Gemini, right?
yeah. And I think what's confusing to me about that is that unlike Gemini, which basically says you can set they call it a thinking budget, which is essentially how much reasoning it's going to apply. And you apply that as a number. GPT sets it as kind of these levels. And previously they had levels for the O series, they had low, medium, and high. And now they've added a new level called minimal. But it's not clear that minimal turns reasoning off, just that it will use a minimal amount of reasoning, whatever that means.
Yeah, that is still left for some interpretation, or what does that mean for sure?
Right. And I think the left for interpretation is intentional, because they want to be able to adjust that later, and when they can adjust
Yeah.
it, when they have bigger context windows, they want to be able to adjust it and so forth. But leaving it using these vague bands, it doesn't help me as a developer know when I should be using one versus another.
Yeah.
Whereas on the Gemini side, and I'll admit, I've got a Gemini bias. We all know I have a Gemini bias. Whereas on the Gemini side, I can very, very clearly tweak the numbers, and I know that if I set it to 0, I've turned reasoning off. And, I'll pay whatever penalty that means. If it means it doesn't work as well, but it's a lot faster, fine. Or I can set it to -1, where it will compute what the most reasonable value is going to be. And that's actually one thing I found interesting, is that there is no equivalent of saying, you figure out how much reasoning there is. The default isn't you figure it out. The default is medium. Whereas on the Gemini side, the default for the Pro and the Flash are for Gemini to figure out what the best value is.
Yeah, that's interesting. We're going to have to dive into that more. There is some guidelines on the website as far as if you've got something that's complex, use the GPT-5 model. If you've got something that's pretty straightforward task, use the mini model. And if you want something more simple than that with basic classification stuff, something that I would think that you would use a small language model for, that's what the mini is for. And there's different prices, like for input token costs and output token costs and things like that for each of those models. So you can find something that's at a price point that's more reasonable.
One of the things that was very impressive to me are those price points. They are much lower than the previous sets of models. They're much lower than Anthropic's pricing points for roughly equivalent models. They kind of match Google's. This is basically saying GPT-5 is just like Gemini 2.5. They're very similar pricing models. They've got very similar sets of features. So it's clear that the pricing wars are heating up, and it's really good to see.
Yeah, it is. And that also comes on the heels of the same week with OpenAI releasing 2 open source models.
That was very interesting. And yeah, how much have you dug into those open source models? Because I haven't had a chance yet.
I haven't yet either, but I just found it interesting that it was like right before the release of GPT-5 that they did that. So they're kind of like, if you want an open source model, it's not GPT-5, but you can still use these other open source models.
The feedback that I've seen around, and I haven't seen a lot of talk, but the talk that I've seen has been along the lines of, these are okay models. They're nothing terribly spectacular, though. They're not really replacements for the GPT series, which you wouldn't expect them to be. But they perform adequately. I think some of the other features of GPT-5, one of the other new features of GPT-5 that I thought was really interesting is they also now have a verbosity setting, so that you can specify in the configuration saying, I want a lot of output, or I want very little output. Yeah. And previously, that's something that we would have to put into our system prompt. Having it as a configuration option is really interesting, makes it an interesting way that we're giving developers new control about these outputs.
Yeah, and talking about outputs, as a developer, one of the things I use a lot is JSON, and they do support JSON for some structured output, but they've talked about other things that you can do as output, so that especially if you have a lot of output, that I guess it makes the output smaller depending on what format it's in. One of the things they talked about, though, that I'm interested in is using some sort of a language grammar, so you can have your own domain-specific language that you create. So the output of the model could be in this language, and then turn that over and have that language then do something. And so that was, you can have a domain-specific language for SQL, for lots of different things, right? So I just found that was interesting of how that might be used more in the future now.
Yes, it's really interesting. This is the constrained outputs feature for it, right?
Yep.
So what's really interesting about that is that they're specifically saying it doesn't need to be JSON. It can be any
Yes.
defined, structured output that you want. Some of the reasons are, quotes inside JSON is messy and ugly and can cause
Yeah.
problems, and a lot of people are having problems with it. But like one of the examples that they give is that if you specify what was known as a context-free grammar, and this is a very
Yes.
specific, well-defined set of rules for how to define a grammar. Um, but some context-free grammars are things like SQL. So if you specify
Yep.
the CFG, the context-free grammar for SQL as the output, it will just output SQL. If you specify the CFG for a programming language, it will just output the structure of that programming language. That's kind of neat. And I think that
Yes.
that's a really powerful tool. I mean, I feel like that a lot of people are going to say, oh, this is a great new tool for vibe coding. I think this is a great new tool for function calling and tool
Yeah,
calling.
I think so too. And I remember something I came across on LinkedIn with Scott Hanselman from Microsoft, who was the conversation was basically that you shouldn't have the model be executing or generating the code for you. You should have the separation, so it generates a grammar in a specific domain specific language format, and then you pass that off. So then you do get some additional guardrails and some structure. In essence, you reduce the hallucinations because the LLM is doing what it can do really well, which is output something in a specific format, and then you hand it off to this some sort of a parser or processor that processes this domain specific language, and it does the thing that you want it to do.
Exactly. And this is the sort of stuff that that everyone has been talking about for a couple of years now. And this is the way I've been putting it for over 2 years now, is using the LLM to translate from fuzzy human descriptions to
Mm-hmm.
well-defined concrete data structures. And that's what a context-free grammar is. So, this notion of
Yep.
using the LLM as that translator, I think it's incredibly powerful. I really think this is an important element that I suspect people are going to largely overlook.
Yeah, I don't think there's only going to be a subset that gets or understands what that means to them, and I think they will be using it extensively in how they process it, and it will solve a lot of problems. So if you don't know much about creating your own grammar or using existing grammars or how to create some sort of domain specific language for some sort of processing that you need done, I think that's an area where you should be doing more research to understand that, because in essence it's doing a translation from one language to another, right? And that's what
Right.
LLMs do really well.
I think what's neat though is that it doesn't even need to be that complicated in every case. So right now
Yep.
JSON gets passed back a lot. And if what you're doing though doesn't require a complicated JSON data structure, if you literally just wanted to return back 3 fields or 5 fields, and one of those fields has a specific set of values to it, that's a context-free grammar. It's a very simple one. And now you can just
Yep.
say, I want I want it to be type colon and one of these 7 values, comments colon and a string, and that's what you get back. It's a lot easier to define than a more complicated JSON schema, or you know any of these other
Yeah.
schema types that are out there right now. So I see a lot. I see a lot
Yep.
coming with this, and it wouldn't surprise me if the other big models adopted something like this very, very quickly.
Yeah, I would think so. So we had mentioned hallucination, and there's a lot of work that OpenAI has done on their GPT-5 model to decrease hallucinations. They've had numerous benchmarks that they showed, and so they were talking about how that's something that's better. And it's not. it was a separate point, but I kind of relate to it with on the hallucination side of things is asking ChatGPT medical questions and getting back or having it process or understand jargon or a report or something. And that is definitely an area where you do not want things hallucinating. And so, and they had a whole section where they interviewed somebody who had cancer, various forms of cancer, and used GPT to help and basically get them up to speed in a way that they could have their first conversation with their doctor being an intelligent conversation, even if it was just a few hours after the report and the diagnosis.
Interesting. And again, I think some of that also starts leaning towards the ChatGPT side. So that they're taking some of these applications, taking some of this training, and using it in the ChatGPT side. One of the things I found interesting, though, is that in the model card, in the information they published about the model, they indicated that the knowledge cutoff for the model, though, is the end of September. So they've been training this for a long time. And so the knowledge cutoff is 10 months ago, which is ages, it feels like.
Yeah.
That was a little surprising to me when I saw that. And actually, that September date is, it isn't even for all of the models, although that's the cutoff date for the big model, GPT-5. The mini and the nano models are listed as having cutoff dates in May 2024. So I don't even know why they're using, but it's really interesting to see they're using different training material for their different models. That's really strange.
Yeah, that is interesting. I hadn't thought about that they would, you'd think that it would just be a subset of the data, but maybe the large model really is the only one that they want to be used to answer questions, and they're going to rely on RAG or other things for those other models to get the additional context knowledge that it needs for specific questions.
That makes sense, but it does kind of speak to their whole concept of, LLMs are sources of knowledge, which I've always debunked. But, it's an interesting reversal. And it says something. I'm not entirely sure what it says, but it says something. Also, I've seen people reporting that although the API says it has a large context window, about 400,000 tokens, ChatGPT says that it still has a 32K context window. So the chat side is using a much smaller context window than the API has available to it.
Yeah. So as far as the ChatGPT, that's something that I do use for research. I also use it for, when it comes to asking questions about coding. And did a number of different examples where the model's becoming more powerful to use in coding, and specifically, tracking down bugs, or also thinking through and communicating with the developer kind of what the thought process is as it's trying to tackle a task, whether it's create a new project of, whether it's something that's more vibe coding or something that's more fixing a bug. It goes through and does the reasoning and outputs what the thinking process is, and tries to it's been improved to try to do more best practices on that. So it'll be interesting to kind of test that out. It's probably time that I get an LLM plugged back into my IDE. It's been a while since I've tried that again, so we'll see how that does.
We did an episode, fairly recently on Claude and Gemini's command line tools, and both of those are well integrated with IDEs as well.
Yep.
But they did say that OpenAI's Codex is working today with GPT-5, so that's interesting.
So one of the other demos that they did was having a conversation with ChatGPT and having it be more natural, some cases more personalized. That could be the memory that it's learning about you. It was showing about plugging into your Google Docs to answer questions, or calendar and Gmail
Ooh.
stuff.
Okay, that's
But
interesting.
yeah, but the thing that was interesting that I kind of caught in the demo was, as you started the conversation and said, "Hey, I want one-word answers, or I want short answers, or go ahead and give me long answers," and that's an interesting problem that we were having from the voice world, is that how do you tailor a response back so that you carry on a conversation, and what's the appropriate amount of detail to give in a response. Um, and
Right.
ChatGPT and GPT LLMs in general have been termed to be more verbose on the outputs, and sometimes that's what you want, and sometimes you want just kind of a short answer or a summary or something like that.
And this is good, and this relates to the API setting of the verbosity. So it sounds like they implemented that in ChatGPT directly as well. But speaking of voice, one of the things that I found really surprising when I looked at the model documentation, it's listed as text and image input, but not audio input. And that's a step backwards from previous models. And similarly, there's no image output either, which all of that kind of surprised me. I mean, certainly Gemini is still supporting image, video, audio input on the 2.5 models. So it kind of surprised me a little that GPT-5 took that kind of step back. On the other hand, they are endorsing large context windows, large output context windows. I mean, the 128K output context window is larger than what Gemini supports, for example. So it's very interesting that these other modalities aren't supported by default. I mean, lots of other features that we would expect are, and this is referring to the API. Their web search tool. It still does streaming. It still does, function calling and tool calling and structured outputs, and all of that we've discussed. But it's just kind of interesting that feature has vanished.
Yeah. So, Ellen, is there anything else? That was kind of the main points that I got out of the video and the announcements. What about you? Anything else?
I didn't get too much else. One of the things, though, that I think struck me, and this is more about the community in general, is that GPT-5 has had this massive buildup for a month. Everybody's been waiting for it. We knew it was coming. We knew the day that it was coming. There was no secret whatsoever. You know, everyone was tuned in, ready to hear the amazing things that OpenAI was going to do. And right afterwards, I jumped on to see what everyone was talking about, and nobody was talking about it. Nobody was talking about it. And by the time people did start talking about it, they were saying things like, "Yeah, it's got some good numbers, I guess. Pretty nice. Yeah." People felt very underwhelmed. I feel like the big message behind that to me is this isn't AGI. AGI is a fantasy.
Yeah.
It's going to be a fantasy. And, stop trying to think that large language models are the solution to AGI. It's a tool, and as a tool, it's beginning to mature and plateau. And we're now, trying to find improvements very much around the edges. The improvements in structured output. That's definitely an improvement, but it's kind of an improvement around the edge. We're going to see some advances in reasoning models, certainly, but they're not going to be big leaps forward. Hopefully we're going to see some improvements in speed and performance so that we can, use some of this on a regular basis. Hopefully we'll see improvements on live audio streaming, which, isn't available for GPT-5 yet. Google still has theirs in a preview mode. So there's a lot that needs to be done there. I don't want to say that this technology is maturing, because I think we have a long way to go before it's mature. But I do think we're now getting to the point where we're not going to see dramatic improvements every 3 months. We're not going to see those big, big things happening every 3 months. And in some ways, I think that's good.
Yeah, I think for the development community, we need to catch up on what are the tools and frameworks that we're going to use to be able to use those. We need to have better established patterns for how to use these different things in a way that's cost effective, in a way that
Yes.
is performant, so it doesn't have the troubling latency issues that it can have. So yeah, I think there's lots happening on the developer community to, as you know, kind of chasing these announcements for the different models, but catching up. But yeah, we're going to see a lot of maturity over the next year, I think, with the tools that developers actually use to use those models in applications.
Exactly. You know, I think we're going to see some improvements when it comes to what's needed for agentic computing. But I'm not entirely sure we understand what the models need to do better or differently or have built into them to support that.
Yeah.
I don't think models should be agents themselves. I think they're a part of that, but they're not the whole thing. But I think we haven't
Yeah.
fully understood exactly where they fit in. I guess my takeaway from this is GPT-5, good progress. Benchmark numbers are nice. You know, as always, they leapfrogged ahead of everyone else until the next model comes out. But I think people need to stop thinking that the next release of any model is going to be the magic AGI, because it's not going to be.
Yeah, I don't think so either. So I think continue to make incremental progress on models, but we've got a lot of catching up to do on tools and actually creating applications using AI, and that's where everybody should be focusing their time.
And I think that's what we are going to be talking about some more in future episodes of Two Voice Devs.
Two voice devs. Take care, Alan.
Take care, Mark.